Okay, this is what's
Thursday,
Thursday,
July 17th,
17,
2003.
2003,
So where were you born?
in Linden, just down the street a ways, short distance. I have never lived at my grandma's. I visited often, and I always had a good time when I went. She would let me gather the eggs and feed the chickens and slop the pigs, and I could go down and scratch the pigs if I was very careful. You know, you stay on one side of the fence and just use a long stick and just scratch their hide. They liked that. But we lived in Salt Lake until I was 14, and then we moved to California. So I had a year and a half. They put me ahead in school when I went to California
Why did they do that?
because I was farther ahead than the rest of the California group.
Because Utah schools were better, or
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. I know I flunked Spanish when I moved to California because our Spanish teacher was from Spain, and I was from a little Utah group that was teaching Spanish, and they didn't have their act together. So I had to go to summer school that year. But I had a year and a half of school left. And I graduated from Manual Arts High School. And that was a few blacks, several Japanese. It was a very good school.
when were you baptized?
When I was 8,
Where were you baptized?
in the tabernacle,
How was that?
it was scary. I didn't have my whole family around me like you did.
Well, Grandpa baptized me. So.
Yeah, I know. But no, because it was cold when we came out. It was November. And my mother was working. That was during the Depression. So if you had a job, that was wonderful. And so my dad held my hand on the way home, so I wouldn't be so cold. Because you come out of there with your hair wet.
So it was just down in the basement of the tabernacle, or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I don't remember a whole lot about it. I don't. Um, but it was. I'm glad it's done. But I had quite a hike to go to church because I walked up the 4th South Hill and it's straight up and down. The church was on 13th East and about 5th South. I don't think that church is there anymore. When I finished grammar school, I went to East High until we moved to California. And I could go most everywhere on my roller skates. I used to ride to the library, which was downtown Salt Lake, the old library. After school. And near my school was a Wonder Bread bakery. And for 50 cents, which was a gold mine, you could buy a whole bag of bakery goods. There was bread and cakes and all kinds of stuff in this bag. And as children, we thought this was wonderful. My mom probably thought it was too, because she used to bake our own bread, and so she probably thought that was, she didn't have to bake bread while that was still fresh.
So how long would it take you to save up 50 cents?
I don't know. I don't remember. But my parents were workaholics. They worked really hard, doing really poorly paid jobs during the Depression. It was hard work. And we, in the winter, we would sleigh ride after dinner and until it got dark. And it was dark early, with the snow. And in the summer, we got to play kick the can, and we would put tin cans on our shoes and clomp around. But,
So this was all still in Salt Lake?
Yeah. Yes, because after we moved to California, we didn't do a lot of that. We didn't do that kind of stuff. And I can only remember one time really being frightened. Well, I guess there was more than one. But we lived quite a ways out, like 33rd South. And it was probably cheap. That's why we moved there. It had an unfinished basement. It was just dirt floor. And I was scared to go down there after dark. But my mother would send me down there for fruits and vegetables. And I remember one afternoon my mother was home, and some poor transient, we always fed the transients even though we didn't have it to give, but we always fed the transients that came by. Maybe not a lot, but we gave them something so they wouldn't starve. And this one afternoon, we had our axe outside by our wood pile, and because we had a wood burning stove, and this man, he didn't knock on the door, he didn't ask for anything, but he approached that axe like it was a gold mine. And my mom was terrified that he was going to take our axe. And but no, he looked at it and looked back at the house and looked at the axe, and then he put it down and went his way. And the house that I remember the most, because I was older, that's when I went to seminary, and that was first thing in the morning, and went to East High. The house that we lived in is all commercial area now.
They tore it down.
Yeah. But Bishop Worthland was my bishop first, and then can't remember his name. One of the apostles.
Is he still alive?
No, he was an attorney, and our church, the podium had big upholstered chairs, 2 or 3 big upholstered chairs on the podium. It wasn't as big as it is today, and we went twice a day, to church, and so it was afternoon. They'd have their big Sunday dinner, and those men sitting in those comfy chairs at that time of day, they got very, very tired and sleepy. It was an effort for them to stay awake. But we did a lot of little plays and learned little songs and in our primary. But and there was a church that was a lot closer. I don't know why I didn't go there. But my dad usually worked on Sunday. And my mom didn't go very often. I went by myself to church. Mm-hmm.
Why didn't your mom go?
I don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't remember her working on Sunday. Maybe she didn't go because my dad didn't go. I don't know. I know that before your grandfather was baptized, I went to church and took my little children. Yeah. And he, until your mom was maybe a year old, I could leave her home with him and he would take care of her. But when she learned to walk, I took her to church. And it was a long way down. When we moved to California, we were so amazed, surprised, because the churches were not the same as they were in Utah. Number one, we didn't have enough churches. And I remember at one point I had an old Buick. It was really. And I had 11 children in the car to go to primary. And we drove a long way out beyond the dairy. And we had to sweep out the church, the building we used as a church. Now there were no meeting rooms, so the classes just met in a corner of the building. Each little class had a little corner to meet in, but we had to sweep out the butts and the bottles. But that built a very close relationship. And Sundays, we didn't have a chapel to meet in. So we rented a building that was the opposite direction, and it was a long way to go twice a day. And I can remember your grandfather going with me this one. He used to go upon occasion. When the Spirit moved him, he would go. And this was Sacrament, and we sat on folding chairs because it was not a church. And an attorney sat right in front of us, and he was trying to be so friendly and nice, and he turned around and started talking to us, but he was talking in such a negative way about people that didn't come to church. And your grandfather, really took offense. He was very nice, but he didn't appreciate that fellow talking to him like that. But he did learn to love that man. And your grandfather had his best friend was LDS. And when Mel's brother went on his mission with Sam.
Who's Mel?
Mel Merrill. His brother went to Australia, and they were going by boat in those days. Your dad went to the pier to see him off, it really impressed him a lot.
What impressed him?
The fact that Sam was giving his time and going to Australia, young kid, and when we were married in the temple, Sam and his wife Pat were our witnesses. But before that, when we moved into Los Angeles, Sam and Pat would come and visit, and we would sit on the floor. We would make hot chocolate, and we always had some sweet little goodie to have with it. And that was fun. It was so nice of them to encourage your grandfather, because he thought so much of Sam, and Sam was such a cut-up. Many years later, we met Sam and Pat again when we moved to San Fernando Valley, and this was the last church that the congregation could help with. So they were working on the parking lot, and after having all that heavy construction trucks and so forth on the parking lot, it was just like iron, and they were using pickaxes to break that up and get it ready for paving. And Sam came out, and he had a bottle of strawberry soda, and he came up and gave your grandfather a hug with one arm, and with the other arm he poured that bottle of strawberry soda down his pants pocket.
Oh.
And it was hot out there. And so your grandfather had sticky pants.
He did it as a joke, or?
Yes, that was his sense of humor.
What did Grandpa do?
Oh, they chased each other all over that parking lot. Yeah. It was,
How old was Grandpa when this happened?
well, we had our 4 children, so he must have been 37, 38. But that move, when we moved to San Fernando Valley, your grandfather had been baptized. And then we moved to this bigger house.
The one that you lived in before you moved?
And it was such a special place. The Lord was really taking care of us, because where we had lived before, there was a lot of young people, but they were not. The Jewish cantor lived 2 doors down. People next door were Catholic. People on the other side of us were Jewish, non-participating Jews. The woman across the street mowed her lawn in her bikini. It was not a church influencing neighborhood. So we moved into this house in San Fernando Valley, farther into San Fernando Valley, and there were so many LDS around us. Our children could play with LDS children and go to school. It was really neat, and they needed your grandfather so much. The first job they gave him was athletic director for the young men, and he loved that. He had always worked with the boys, Larry and his age group. In the Gray Y, which is YMCA, and he liked that job, but they weren't happy with having him have just one job, so they then gave him the job of the work, getting the work crew to come together on Saturdays.
To build the chapel?
Yeah. They had people coming, during the day and the evenings, but your grandfather was on Saturdays. And there used to be, the bishop. We would go drive by the church at night after dark, and they would have spotlights up on the roof, and our Relief Society president would be up there hammering on the roof, and Jim Kenning and some older gentlemen would be, and the wind would be howling. The wind came down that pass from the mountains, and it would just howl. And so it was cold, but those guys would be out there hammering their nails. So then we would go home and make hot chocolate and donuts and bring up to them.
What was your calling during this time?
I was first counselor in the primary. But we had enough people. See, the valley, San Fernando Valley, just opened up. There weren't enough houses. There weren't enough churches. All these guys that had been in the service were coming home, and there was no place for them to go. They would come to San Fernando Valley and take whatever they could get. And we had 1,100 people in our ward. So we had 2 primaries, 2 Sunday schools, 2 elders, 2 priests. It was one. We had a chapel. We had a building that had 2 chapels. That's the only one I know of that had two chapels. And when we had the summer activities, when BYU sends their people out to the outlying districts to teach and have classes and so forth. Yeah, they loved it because we had a huge cultural hall and we packed that place. They loved coming. We were so appreciative of their efforts. But that move was the best move. The Lord was just really looking out for us because they needed us. They made use of us. They got your grandfather really involved, and he loved every minute of it. And his best buddies were Jim Kenning and Jim Rose. And they weren't satisfied until they got him to go to the temple. And then they put him in the bishopric.
After you went through the temple?
Uh-huh.
How long were you in, is it Pasadena where you moved to?
No. We were in Sepulveda.
Sepulveda? So how long after you moved there till Grandpa went through the temple?
Not very long.
We'll pause.
George. And then she left him.
Who was this again? Since we're starting over.
Grandpa's mother.
Okay.
Jenny.
What was her last name?
Jenny McIntosh.
That's her blood mother. His blood mother. Okay.
And she was married to Phillips. And they were divorced. And she left him and went with his partner, which was Everett Hussey.
Everett Hussey?
Mm-hmm.
How do you spell the last name?
Hussey.
So that's where Grandpa's first name came from?
Mm-hmm. And they lived in the Boston, Massachusetts area. Your grandfather was born in Longmeadow. And then they had Martha and Bill, your grandfather, and Dick. And when we went back to Massachusetts, your grandfather said it was the house that they lived in. But I don't know whether it was or not. And the cellar door was one of those slanted doors that they used to slide down, where it opens up and you walk down the steps down into the cellar. But, and as I recall, it was frame, siding, and brick. And in the front was the common, which was a lot wider than our street, wide, and it was all grass and trees. It's very nice. Kind of like having your own park. And but when his mother married Crosby, they were not allowed to talk about his blood father at all. And his blood father,
About
Huzzy, was, he go to Yale. He belonged to several chess clubs. He sang professionally, not in nightclubs or anything like that, but he sang. Other religions pay their organists, their music people, and he would sing in church, and he wrote poetry. He wrote poetry to Nana, his wife, and they. He would sit and hold the children and rock them and sing to them, and they called him Papa. And I don't know what happened. She met Fred. I think they used to play cards a lot. And so when she and Fred were married in Portland, the day they were married, they came back to the house and picked up all the children except George and Eunice, I think, the two oldest Phillips children. And so there would have been Thelma and Martha and Bill and Ev and Dickie all came in this one car to California with the grandma and grandpa, or the grandpa that lived with them. So that was a whole bunch. And they also brought a Huzzy with them as far as Fort Worth. He left them in Fort Worth. He did come to California, but I don't know exactly when, because he died in 1935. Yeah, and he's buried. When I started doing genealogy, I found where he was buried. So your grandfather and I went to the cemetery, Calvary Cemetery, found where he was buried, and he didn't have a headstone. So your grandfather bought a headstone, and then he took his brothers and sisters to the cemetery. And I'm sure they did not have a ceremony like your grandfather would have done had they not been there. But I'm sure they expressed thoughts.
So how was Grandpa related to this guy?
That was his blood father.
Oh, okay. How did you guys find the grave without it being marked?
We went to the custodian at the sexton at the cemetery.
So he just knew on the lot, but nobody had enough money to buy a headstone or anything?
Well, since his grave was a pauper's grave, so he was underneath someone else. So they made arrangements where they could put this headstone in relation to the grave. Yep. And they thought that was great. Then I wasn't frowned on anymore because I had found him. They resented me.
Why?
Because I went to the records and found him. They didn't want me doing that.
Uncle or
that was
Grandpa's
their
brothers?
That was their business, not mine. Yeah. Yeah. But Grandpa was very close to his brothers and sisters, and yeah. And I just have the one brother, and since we did spend a lot of time together when we lived in California. We played a lot of canasta, pinochle, made fudge, made divinity. Something that they could do where we weren't talking religion, because they didn't want to hear Mormon doctrine.
Your parents?
My brother and his wife. Yeah.
So he's not LDS?
He is.
Oh.
He's an elder.
But back then he didn't?
He didn't. His wife, Dorothy, died. She had cancer. And after she died, my mother died. And so my brother and my dad lived together, which was very nice for both of them. And then my brother remarried, and then my dad got his own little apartment, and yeah. But after, my brother was always invited for the holidays. And sometimes she would bring her family, which was from the down below Mexico. And they would be here visiting, or in California visiting, and maybe at the last minute I would know they were coming. And that was okay. It worked out fine. But when you're right after your grandfather, maybe he wasn't baptized yet. I don't know. But it's when we were living in one of those wards that didn't have a building, and you sat on folding chairs, and it's hard to keep little children quiet. On Fast Sunday, your grandfather would say, "I don't understand how those men can stand up there and cry." At that time, we had a dentist for a bishop, and he had a ranch in Utah. And so he would bring those city guys to his ranch, and they would do ranch chores, and it was a new experience for them. And your grandfather would get so upset. I don't know how. Those grown men were signing off for the evening, and I'm so grateful for my family. I could not manage by myself without my family. And it's so, even though, you live in Utah and everyone is LDS, most everyone is LDS, it isn't the same as your family. I love my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. They're really special people. And I feel so blessed to have them. and have them willing to spend time with me